Hello and welcome to the Jazz Jam Podcast. I am your host, Dwayne Gunnels, joined by my co-host, Max Levy. In this episode, we're going to be getting into a newer album in the spirit of Into. So without further ado, I'm going to kick it over to my co-host, Max Levy.
Welcome back. We are here doing the second part of our podcast where we are reviewing a newer jazz album that either recently hit the market or relatively recently has hit the marketplace, either on radio, through album sales, and has grasped some attention. And this is one that definitely has. This one is by, as mentioned earlier, a South African pianist by the name of Nduduzo Makhathini. It is his second Blue Note album called In the Spirit of Into. And I think it's good to mention just at least some things about kind of where South African jazz has been and where it's going and its place in music and in the jazz world. So there is kind of a history of jazz being present in South Africa, influenced by colonialism and the merging of some cultures. Starting in the 1920s, there was some jazz groups in Queenstown, which was at the time known as Little Jazz Town. And at that time, they were emulating a lot of the New Orleans traditional style jazz groups that were coming out on record starting in the early 1920s from originally New Orleans, Louisiana, and were recorded in places like New York City and Chicago. And so some of that was reaching South Africa. And eventually their own style developed where they had kind of a 3 or 4 chord progression that became standardized, similar to how the blues became standardized in the United States, and how, some of the best jazz is influenced by the blues, and some of the best South African jazz is influenced by this style known as Marabi, Marabi. And it kind of developed slowly over time, but generally it's kind of a 4-chord progression, and it combines African rhythms with jazz harmony a lot of the time. And so a supreme example is a tune called Soweto, spelled Soweto, by Abdullah Ibrahim, who was a piano player from South Africa, who later became kind of famous in the world as a jazz musician. Him, along with Hugh Masekela, a trumpet player, that became well known with his version of Grazing in the Grass, which was a 1968 pop hit. Both were South African players that immigrated to the Western world once apartheid started really being implemented, and they started controlling the gatherings that you could have. They were limiting the number of people. They were limiting, the types of music. They saw jazz as anti-apartheid music, which it was a lot of the time. And so a lot of that music was suppressed by the government of South Africa for a variety of different reasons. One of which was the racial divide that was enforced during that time in South Africa. So there's a history of jazz music being present in South Africa. And around that time in the 1950s and 60s, there were bebop groups, one in particular where Hugh Masekela and Abdullah Ibrahim performed with, the Jazz Epistles. And they became kind of famous. And unfortunately, early 1960s, they started implementing apartheid regulations. And a lot of the music went underground, or the musicians moved and began to play elsewhere. Since 1994 or so, the mid to late 90s, when apartheid ended, there has been a resurgence of jazz in South Africa from both, musicians and audience members. There is a scene in Johannesburg and in Cape Town. A lot of the musicians come from both those areas, and there's a vibrant scene. once again in South African jazz.
Yeah, I one thing I want to add to this is I actually have some friends that are South African that I worked with when I worked in a country club in Boone, North Carolina. And one thing that was weird to hear them say was like, I'd tell them that I played jazz, and they're like, "Oh, I like jazz," and they would name some like South African jazz musicians, and they weren't musicians, but they were like, "Yeah, I like jazz. Here are some of my favorite musicians," and there were multiple people who knew about jazz and liked jazz, and they're like, "Yeah, it's really becoming more popular in South Africa," which is kind of crazy because like I could say like 20 jazz musicians' names here and standing on the corner in Wilmington, and no people think I was speaking in tongues, so.
Unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah, so it's cool to see that it's really being revitalized there, and they're latching onto it. So this album is Nduduzo Makhathini is just a prolific South African pianist and composer that we've got playing right now. He's on Blue Note. So I'm super excited to get into this album and kind of see what's going on with South African jazz and the state of South African jazz.
Yeah, and one of the preeminent performers of this kind of new resurgence is Nduduzo Makhathini. He is quoted as saying, "Jazz is a genre that relies on surrounding energy fields." And I think that's a great quote because it kind of just explains a lot of what's going on in his music. There's a very spiritual approach. There's an emphasis on sort of the history of South Africa in his music, and the racial strife of apartheid, the issues of suppression of the soul is kind of what I get with the history of what went on. And he a lot of times seems to showcase that. There is an excellent YouTube interview where from a couple months ago where they're interviewing Nduduzo Makhathini after doing a concert at Dizzy's Club Coca-Cola in New York City. So that's a great interview to just check out and see where he's particularly coming from with his approach to this music.
Yeah, I really appreciate that quote when he says relies on surrounding energy fields. I think that sometimes that can get lost, especially when you get into the more academic side of jazz, to where you're learning, it almost feels formulaic. And I've met guys who I feel play like that. And I feel like jazz is, what I love about jazz is it's such a good expression of self and of feelings and experiences that I think that's one thing that Nduduzo does so well, is it feels like his playing in this album and his composition is just such an expression of himself, his experiences, his spirituality, his African roots, and that's one thing that's really going to be a theme throughout the album. It's really beautiful, and I think is a good thing to remember and to keep keep in jazz. Is it's so personal, and it can be such a good way, and that's the greats are so great at telling their story through the music, and that's one thing that I really like here, so I'm excited to get into and look at with this album.
Yeah, and I just wanted to quote a little bit. There is a review of this album in Downbeat. I believe it's from the July issue. There were a few people who reviewed it. 3 of them gave it 3.5 stars. 1 gave it a full 4 stars. And so the review says, quote, "It's a bevy of experiences, including meditative chants of the Zionist Church, lessons learned at the altars of Seleku, Ibrahim, and Tyner, political forays in sync with protests erupting in his homeland, and the bonding of voices, both on the bandstand and in the streets, an act he calls the invocation of collectiveness. In lesser hands, its delivery might have been muddled, but Makhathini sculpts his presentation with insight and authority." And so I think that's a great way to put it. Is there are a lot of times in this album I feel like where there could have been moments where things kind of fell apart, or somebody missed something, or it didn't come across in the way that they expected. But because of Makhathini's experience and musicality, everything seems to come off pretty much as intended, and overall he does a really good job of what he was trying to do.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think that this album, it's almost like dichotomous to what we listen to with Soul Station, which feels so well crafted. Not that this isn't well crafted. This feels much more free and open, and a collective, like a conscious experience of Makhathini and what he's experienced, and not so much like, crafted out and everything's written out. It feels like just kind of that like experience, and it's definitely good to listen to. There's a lot of elements free where things are free and open and kind of raw, which is nice. And it feels like it might lack structure at sometimes, but it never lacks direction, if that makes sense. So
That's right.
Let's
it's always moving.
Yeah.
I feel like it's always on a journey.
Yep. Yeah, you might not understand exactly where you are, but in the long run you get where you're going and you understand why you were there. And that's one thing that this album does really well. Let's get into, I just quickly want to mention, we mentioned earlier, but this does feature a cast of mostly South African players on it. Saxophonist Linda Sikahane, trumpeter Robin Fasikak, vibraphonist Dylan Tabisher, bassist Steven D'Souza, percussionist Gauntse Makine, and then drummer Dane Paris, as well as some vocalists, which I really like on this album. Nduduzo Makhathini, which I'm assuming is probably related to Nduduzo, but I'm not for sure on that. Anna Widauer, and American saxophonist out of Philadelphia, Jaleel Shaw, is featured on one of the more impactful tracks on the tune. So with no further ado, let's hop right into the album. And I'll go ahead and try to say this first name on the album. Let's see what we got here. Unankanyamba. Unankanyamba. How's that sound?
That sounds pretty accurate to me.
Unankanyamba. So that's what I wish that our Zulu is. I have friends that are Zulu, but that's the best I can do on that.
Yeah, that it's important to mention that the names on this album are Zulu. They come from the Zulu language and dialect and everything. So we're doing our best.
It's not something that we're super familiar with. We'll do our best. I know some things about how the language is pronounced, but not everything. So yeah, Unankanyamba is the first track on the album. And so this one, it starts out, you're just very African rhythm in the rhythm section. It sets the scene, and it kind of sets the scene throughout the whole track and remains. There's this rhythmic with the vibraphone, the percussionist, the drummer, and the piano throughout the entire track. The horns come in, and there's a good deal of dissonance we get right off the bat in the melody. The melody is there, and it's present, it's written, but there's dissonance that comes in. And then when we get into the saxophone solo, it's kind of free and open, and you get a good of reference to the melody, but I feel like that's kind of one of our only tonal centers in the saxophone solo. There's not a whole lot of reference to a tonal center other than the melody, which is at the beginning of the tune, and then you get this driving percussion, this rhythm that I mentioned in the beginning. It's maintained through the whole track. The piano solo, very monk feel to it, lots of dissonance, not a huge focus on a tonal center. And yeah, that's kind of sets the scene for what you're going to get a lot on this album. So what do you think about how this album starts out, Max?
I think it starts out really well with what it intends to accomplish. I do like some particular aspects of this track. Number one being that it's important to note with each one, I think, whether they're in a kind of a 2 feel or a 4 feel or a 3 feel, thinking 2/4, 3/4, or 4/4. Here they're pretty much doing a 2/4 kind of time signature. And I just like the layering of this track, in particular the way they're playing with time a little bit. They're keeping that two fill going, but the horns in particular are a little laid back on the melody, and so it's not quite in time, but it's also always moving. And the
Yeah.
way it, you know,
That's one thing that I notice is you get a lot of that, like you get the African, and this is one thing that this track does, is you get that African driving rhythm in the rhythm section below to give you that time, that driving like sense of like driving, but then you get the horns and some of the solos over top with it just are seeming to disregard that sense of time and just free and open and here and there and expand and contrast the sense of time, which is interesting because it's like it's kind of like multiple facets at once of this driving thing and then like this like loose melody, and it's a cool feeling. Yeah, I definitely get what you're saying there.
and the last thing I would mention is there is an obvious influence of Thelonious Monk in Makhathini's playing that comes out on this track in particular during some of his solo, and it's kind of illustrated throughout the album later on as well, that there's a clear influence of McCoy Tyner and Thelonious Monk in his playing.
Yeah. I think there are a few. Yeah, that's definitely on the piano side. Those guys, you'll see a lot of influence of those guys come in, and it's kind of cool. And there are some other guys who will come in influentially wise later, but it's kind of the theme of this album to see how he mixes that influence with the African jazz feel and the African rhythms, and that's just like right in your face in the beginning of the album. That's what you're getting right off the bat is this driving African rhythm and this dissonant melody and the free jazz feel, and the solo is very Monk-esque in the delivery of it, the piano solo that is.
Yeah, and on that, the way the track ends, I appreciate the way they fade out. They don't do it all at once. It's each instrument cuts out one at a time, and it slowly, gets softer, and it's very musically satisfactory the way they faded out on this track.
I do like that as well. One thing that I thought was interesting and kind of a Monk-esque thing to do as well is the second time when they go back to the melody after all of the solos, there's this piano lick that Makhathini's playing that he's overshadowing this dissonant melody with, and he keeps playing it over and over, and it's above the melody, and it's interesting, but it's a very Monk-esque thing to do, to have this melody that you've already introduced, and you come back to the melody, but there's this thing that's contrasting the melody, this piano lick that's just over chanting over and over again, and I thought that was very interesting. It felt very Monk-esque to do something like that, like this dissonant melody and then this counter argument of this piano lick that's just repeating over and over. So that was interesting. It kind of like struck me at first, like, oh man, like, but then I was like, I kind of see what he's going for here. And then you get the fade out with the instruments backing out one by one until I think you just got the congas at the end, and they finish you out on the same driving rhythm that started the song out. So
yep. How about the next one?
Cool. So next is a tune entitled Mama, which takes us in a just completely different direction than where we started. We started with this. I mean, it's definitely the African influence is still there, but this tune is very, very much more sultry. You get a more traditional style shuffle in the percussion. Oh wait, hold on, sorry. Oh no, sorry. This is more of a ballad, and so this is. Basically, it feels like a ballad. It's an ode to a mother that has passed. I looked at the lyrics in English, and it talks about thanking their mother and the amazement and the blesses and how the mom is left and the soul rest in peace. And then said, we'll meet again. Like I'll meet you soon, and I guess in heaven, which kind of speaks to the spiritual. We start to get that spiritual feel in the album here. So yeah, you get a whole feature of the vibraphone in here. A lot of the vibraphone on this album is really well done, and we don't see a whole lot of vibraphone getting played on modern jazz stuff. So I really, really enjoyed this tune. I thought it's not super jazz in like the sense of like jazz. Like the first song was pretty free jazz African mix. This more feels like just a ballad, and it's mostly sung, not really a solo, but it's super powerful. And I think the melody it's enchanting and beautiful. And I think it's a really nice track. I think it's the most listened to track on Spotify, and I can see why, because it's more approachable. It's not super free jazz. It's something that very African, enchanting power ballad. It feels like.
Yeah, I do appreciate the subject matter. As someone who personally lost their mom at a young age, like I did, I identify a little bit, with the lyrics and the overall feeling that this song emulates across to the listener. I think it's very well done. I think it is powerful. It does have a nice build towards the middle to end. It kind of builds up in the fifth into the 6th minute. And there seems to be a common theme with how they're ending a lot of the songs on the album. They tend to do fade outs on almost every one. And in this one, the fade out seems so close to being almost done, where the music would just naturally end on a final chord or ending lick or something, that if they had just lasted another 5 to 6 seconds, it would have just ended naturally, it seems to me. Now, I don't know. I wasn't in the studio. It's just me listening to it. But I don't know why the fade out was used in this one. It seems to cut short the overall emotive approach that it's trying to go for.
I have a theory on this, and I think they're doing this on purpose to you, and I'll tell you why. I think one thing that this album harps on a lot, and you can tell me if you agree or not, is this spirituality. And a lot of this album feels like it's a journey through life. And I think that what they're going for here is, instead of ending a song with what you want, like that final chord, I think it's more of like it feels like you're almost falling asleep, and like the song is just dwindling into the background. You're slowly falling asleep, and the day is, like you've gone through this experience, and now you're at peace, and you've come to, I feel like that might be what they're going for, is this, instead of just ending everything with like such a bow on it, they want you to just like ease out of ease out of what's been going on, and almost feel like you're falling asleep to the experience of the day of this track. Do you see what I'm saying there?
I do see what you're saying, and I think that is a great way to wrap your head around it. I'm not denying that that's likely the case.
It seems like it has to be intentional, because they do it a lot on this album. So it's hard to infer exactly, but I think it has to be intentional with how much it's done.
Yeah, I guess you're right. There's a purpose to it, just like there's a purpose to everything else in that track. So why expect anything else? Yeah, I think you're right.
But it definitely is hard when we come from like this background of like wanting it to be like, like we want that. We're used to that. So when it's just like, it feels like they're still playing, and it's just like fading and fading and fading until there's nothing. We want that finality, but this album, it's not gonna give it to us, and it keeps doing that. So yeah, all in all, a really beautiful track, super powerful, super emotive. I really like this track. It's one that definitely spoke to me. I feel like it invokes a lot of emotions, and it's a really nice track and very different from the beginning track. So let's get into the third track on the album, which is Re-Amathongo. This one is the more traditional style shuffle in the percussion. The bass line, it stays the same throughout the whole song. It's this kind of similar bass line that pushes through. And then this solo, lots of monk influence here again on the solo, and lots of free jazz comping elements throughout the song. This feels like a more so getting into that monk and free jazz kind of feel, more so than the first track even. This feels more so like a more so traditional free jazz song than we had before.
That's right. It's definitely a 4 feel 4/4 time. There's a repeating 2-bar kind of chord structure with that ostinato in the bass, like you mentioned. The drum groove at first seems really simple, but it lies in such a pocket that it fits with everything that's going on. It's just keeping that groove going. I think that groove from the drums is killer. The percussion adds a nice touch. Um, there's some meaning with the song. Amathongo is a Zulu word, I think referring to the spirits of the dead that live among us. Um, I tried to do a little research with the meaning of these words, and so that's kind of what I came up with. It's a reference to those who we've lost, but knowing that they're still with us. And so there's a kind of ominous feeling overall with how the song comes across. It's kind of reminds me of something like purgatory, or kind of the journey from life to death, or from death back into life, if you're into reincarnation and those sorts of things. I will say here the trumpet solo is a little more dynamic than it was giving us in earlier tracks. The piano solo is a little dissonant at times, continuing that monk influence, and more so here. And back to the fade out. This one annoys me the most because they fade out right at the beginning of the tenor saxophone. I think it's on tenor of the saxophone solo.
I think it's pretty much all tenor on the album.
Well, there's a mix of.
I think there's some alto as well. Yeah.
There's some. Here there's on the album. There's some soprano, some alto, and some tenor. And here the fade out begins as the sax solo is beginning, and I really am dumbfounded as to why that is a thing. I don't understand. I get we need to keep track of time and not go on for so long, but if you're going to have a sax solo, have a sax solo. They could have ended the track 20 seconds earlier. I don't understand. I'm going to harp on that continuously. That because, if they had continued, this would be my favorite on the album. If they had continued through the sax solo, this would have been my favorite. But it's not because of that.
I think this is kind of, it's going to be a theme, and I think it's going to all make... This is one thing that this album did, is I was confused by things a lot, like this fade out. Like, why? Like, the track's still going, why are we fading out? But I feel like as I kept going on, things started to make more sense. This one is hard to, in the moment, realize, like, what's going on? This song isn't over. Why are they fading out? So I think you're more annoyed as a saxophone player than I am, because you're like, wait, this is the good part. Like, the saxophone's like, come on, why are you taking this away from me? Like,
that's right.
So
I will not get over it with that particular song and the way they ended it. The other fade outs, I can kind of see where you're coming from, but with that one, I will forever have an issue with.
It'd be interesting to hear Makhathini talk about why they chose to fade this one out, because I think this was the one that was kind of the weirdest, the most abrupt, and seemed to be in the middle of something that was starting to head back in a direction, and then they just kind of cut it off. So it is interesting, but it does lead into one of the most unique tracks on the album, which is Nyaninini Lee. And this one starts out with singing over this free-form rhythm section. The melody, lots of dissonance. It seems like there's no real groove or sense of time in this one. The time is really ebbing and flowing on this one. The way I like to the way that this kind of spoke to me was the time ebbs and flows like a wave in the percussion, and the percussion crashes on shore with the wave at times. It's ebbing and flowing and kind of crashing at times. This song is definitely the most out there track on the album. Very loose, very free. It's an interesting track. What do you think about it, Max? What did this song say to you?
Well, it says a lot. It can say a lot. I like how you're imagining, you're conjuring up an image that the music expresses. I think, that's the best we can do with this. It is kind of free jazz. But one thing to say is I am very impressed. Most of the melody lines that, the horns that are on the track play along with the piano, even though the time is kind of inconsistent and free, the melodies are usually always played very well together. And so they're feeling that wave that you're expressing. They're feeling that together, and they're moving through those waves musically so well that, it actually does impress me, even if, this particular song isn't something I would normally want to listen to, but I am impressed by some things that go on.
This is the kind of track, and I get what you're saying there. It's very free, but it's so artistic in the way that it feels like they're moving together in a space that is like free and lacks clarity and time, but they're moving together through this darkness almost. And this is the kind of track that if you just clicked on this album and clicked on this track and listened to it, you'd be like, what the hell is going on? Like, what am I listening? It makes no sense if you were to listen to it out of order, but I do think it does make sense in the context of the album. And it definitely does. Yeah, like I said, with the wave and the flowing, and then I think there's definitely a purpose for this song, but stand alone by itself, if you were just to be like, hey, listen to this song to a friend, they'd be like, what the hell are you playing for me? But that's...
they would be lost. But, when you think about it, when you hear it, when you listen to it, you analyze it, everything pretty much is intentional. It's purposeful, as you said. There's a lot of interaction, too, between the keys and the bass with the drums. And the way the rhythm section, complements each other, it is really, something to be impressed by. The sax solo is kind of cool, a little different. And the way they just move in and out of each other musically, the different instruments, it is impressive.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think when I listened to this the first time, I felt lost. I felt like I didn't know what the hell was going on. And I think that now that I think about it, I think he probably wants you to feel like that. I think he probably wants you to wonder what's going on. So
yeah,
while I was feeling that, he's probably got me exactly where he wants me, because I was intrigued because I've heard enough to hear what's going on in this album, and I'm interested. But then he throws this curveball at me, and I'm like, what is going on? Where are we going? And I'm feeling confused. I'm not sure. It's out there. Where, like, what's going to happen next? Like, are we just going to fully dive into this free jazz chaos? But so I think it's definitely intentional, and I'm starting to see that now. It's taken a whole day for me to kind of realize, while I was lost yesterday, I feel like I was lost. He wanted me to be lost, because the next tune on the album is a tune entitled Mlewaini, and it is, in my opinion, just a masterpiece. It stands above every other track on this album. This is the kind of track you could have someone listen to and just be like, listen to this track, and it's just incredible. It fuses all of these elements so well in this track. It feels very, very McCoy Tyner, very Impressions McCoy Tyner kind of feel to it. The modalism, it's there throughout. The piano solo is just absolutely brilliant. It has direction. It's free. It has elements, and the modalism and the free jazz and the African jazz. And then Jaleel Shaw, who's playing on this one, the American saxophone player we talked about, really, really special solo on this one. The Coltrane influence is just extremely evident, and the track drives beautifully. This is a masterpiece. I was after feeling lost, I felt like I was found, when I got into this track. This track makes the previous one be okay.
Yeah.
I was so lost, and now I was so not lost. It's like I forgot that I was ever lost.
Yeah. And this song in particular screams John Coltrane Quartet of 1965, or 63 to 65.
Yep.
We're getting McCoy Tyner, we're getting Train, we're getting some Elvin Jones with the drums, great bass playing. It's probably one that most straight ahead lovers would enjoy, and there's just a lot of drive and energy throughout the song. I do like the melody too. It's I think I like the longer notes of the melody, along with some rhythmic syncopated movement that happens later in the melody. And it's a killer solo. Jalil Shaw is an amazing player, great future ahead of him, but he's already doing the thing. He's already in it. I'm more of a tenor player, but he's awesome on the alto sax. And it is, I also get a little sense of Kenny Garrett, a little bit. But it's definitely, Coltrane Quartet that we're feeling on this one. And yet again, there is another fade out on ending the track.
This one's not as bad though.
No, it's not.
But it does fade out again, which is, at this point you're like, okay, it's definitely on purpose. You're like, they're doing, this is a theme. Yeah, it feels like if you took the Coltrane Quintet and just put them in the middle of Africa, in like the middle of apartheid, and like this, this like African conflict through the lens of this modal free jazz, this freer jazz modalism, post-bop era. That's what it feels like to me, and it's a beautiful expression of the African experience through that lens. And this this is the note I wrote. I said, masterpiece, and may have saved the album just when I was starting to wonder what the hell was going on.
And that's why it's placed where it is.
Yeah.
It is really curated in such a great way.
Yeah. So if this is the standalone, the track from the album that definitely stands above the rest, in my opinion. Beautiful, so driving, so great, so much energy. A great tune. Let's move on to Re-Amathongo. Max, what do you have here?
Well, I believe the word Amathongo refers to bones, and so I think a lot of the lyrics are referring to human bones and all of that, the Zulu word. And I believe this is a reimagined version of another song. That's why it's called Re-Amathongo, because Makhathini recorded Amathongo on an earlier album, I think in 2017, with that same song title. So this is kind of a redo version that's, I think, quite different.
Yeah, a reprise almost.
Yeah, overall, it's a slow, 4/4 feel. I appreciate the English lyrics on this one. And there's a 4-bar horn motive or motif that is played along with background vocals that I really like. The trumpet solo is kind of somber. And on this one, we feature the soprano sax, which has a nice timbre to it. And the way the trumpet and the soprano sax blend on some of their lines, it's just done really well. It's in tune, it's dynamic, and just in particular the trumpet and soprano sax, their blend and the way they play together really comes out to me on this song.
Yeah, that's definitely kind of a theme through the album, is like there's a very free and open feeling, but at the same time the musicians are all so clearly on the same page, and they're blending so well, and the melodies are put together well and played well. It's not like it's sloppy. It's free, but it's not sloppy. These guys and gals,
that's right.
They know they know what they're doing. They know what's going on, and they're able to navigate that feeling of that loose feeling through such good technical mastering in the melodies and the way that they blend and play everything. It's definitely very well done for the style and what they're going for. Yeah, this one has a very bittersweet feeling to this one. It's kind of the emotion that I get after that very, very energetic and driving track. This one kind of feels like a bittersweet feeling after that is what I was getting on this one.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
What's the next one?
The next one is Abantwana Belanga is the next song. And so this one starts with spoken word in Zulu over bass playing, which I think is cool. It feels very in place in the album. And then we get an upbeat and very modal melody this time. And the note that I wrote on this one is Tyner and Coltrane meet Zulu in 2022.
I think you're right.
So kind of a rehashing of the Mlewaini kind of feel, but slightly different, very upbeat feeling on this one.
Yeah, and on this one, I think the bass in particular comes out from the background a little more with those underneath those opening vocals. They're really expressive with what they're playing. Sometimes they're playing more than one note at a time. They're kind of doing chords. It's very rhythmic. And just what the bass does seems impressive to me. And I like the little space in between that opening, and then they come in hot with, kind of the melody, the 16th note line. Trumpet comes in. I love the way the instruments layer on top of each other. I did have to really focus in and pay attention to where the beat was. Sometimes it was hard for me to keep track of B1 or B4. But that's on me, not on them. They did what they intended to do, and they were great at it.
Well,
but
I think that's easy to happen when you get this very modal, upbeat song that's like the chords aren't necessarily moving, like resolving when it's modal like that. You're kind of staying around. That's a point of modalism, right? You're staying around. You're centering around the tone center, right, in different modes of that. So I think can be a reason it's hard to kind of feel where one is, because it's not like we're going 3 6 2 5 1, because that's easy when you've got that resolution. But when you're in this kind of free and modal space, it doesn't always have to go back to one on the first beat. Like you can be in a different place on one, and that's fine because of the style of the tune. So I get that and stuff. It's hard. It is hard though to hear it sometimes, but.
Yeah, and this is another one that reminds me of, the John Coltrane Quartet, 63 to 65, It's straight from there.
Yep, very similar feeling, yeah, which is good, but with the same African influence. I mean, the whole album is going to have this influence. It's not going away. They're not, so it's awesome.
That's right.
Yeah, pays homage to those guys while, displaying their African roots and African rhythms, so... Yeah, and Max, I think this one fades out again. How do you feel about that?
I had, 14 question marks after why the fade? I don't know.
Another is really fade. Starting to bother Max at this point.
Yeah, this one didn't bother me as much as Unankanyamba, but it's still there. I don't know. I have questions.
Oh, man. All right, so let's get into the 8th track on the album. It's called Omnyama is the name of this one. It has a piano and congos call and response-esque intro to it. Settles into what feels like an African tribal rhythm, and then you get some pretty cool tribal chant style of singing. And then... I guess that kind of feels like it's the melody of the tune, and then you settle into some saxophone and piano solos, and it feels like this is the track that like really ties everything together with how well they blend the African roots, the tribal singing, the elements of jazz. It has kind of all the elements of jazz that we've already heard, whether it be like bop, modal and free jazz. You kind of get all of it into one tune, crafted into one tune the way that this one's presented. The African rhythms, the chants, the jazz, the free jazz, the modalism. I think this is just this at this point, this is when this album is like they've kind of thrown so many things at you, whether it's these enchanting like melodies that are sung, this free jazz feel, the modalism, the very African driving rhythms, and I feel this one is like they just like are just like boom, all of it's brought together. This is the meaning of this album. This is the song that puts it all together for you. So I think this is a super critical song on the album.
I would agree that this brings a lot of the elements in different tracks all at once together.
Yep.
And because of that, the arrangement is a little more predictable. This one has kind of like a really extended opening intro from the percussion, which I really dug. I mean, I was waiting for a percussive intro where we don't have vocals or we don't have horns. Just let the percussion bring it in, do something creative, and then let the groove sit in. And that happens on this one. Right about the 1 minute mark is when the groove comes in. We got a 4/feel. I love the rhythmic groove on it. There's a piano ostinato that keeps, repeating itself. It's a repeated pattern, gets reinforced as the song goes on. There's a little dissonance from the playing here. And the one thing that struck out to me on this track was how smooth and perfectly they go in between a 4/4 feel into a 2 feel. And the grooves are so similar that it kind of just hits you out of nowhere, and you think, oh wait, we're now in 2.
Yep.
When we were just in 4. And the way they move through that, and then later on they go back to the 4 feel from the 2 feel, it's just so effortless. And I just love the way they do that on this track. It's so distinctive, so creative. I just really like that.
Yeah, I think they just did. Yeah, it's so, this track feels like it's just so well put together, and that's like part of, they were able to fit. It's kind of crazy how they're able to fit all of these elements that they've hinted at and that they've referenced in the previous tracks, and they've spent full tracks kind of referencing them, to be able to put it all together in one track and make it feel conducive and feel and flow so creatively and so well, I thought was just brilliant. This track is brilliant in the way it's able to do that, and the way it's able to encapsulate the entire album into one track, and into you can tell we're starting to get to a place where everything you've had so many feelings and so many experiences throughout spirituality, and it feels like it's starting to make sense. That's, I think, one thing that when I got to this track, everything that I had felt before and I experienced before started to make sense on this track. It's like, oh wow, these all are connected in this way, and it makes sense to me now.
Absolutely. The only thing I would add is I'm being kind of musically specific, but around the 4-minute 30 mark, there's a really cool rhythmic piano pedal that lays on top of everything else. And to me, that just drives the intensity even more so. And it really creates more movement to a song that I thought already had enough movement.
Yeah.
It just works so well, everything coming together.
Yeah. One thing I noticed is your notes on this, you get kind of deep into some of the musical elements, and like I think it's easy for you to nerd out because the song is so well put. There's so much that you can look into, and you can say, oh, like this is something so cool that they did that made it do this that I didn't even knew I needed, but then they did it, and you've got so much about the musicality of this track that I think it speaks to what we were already saying about it.
Yep. And I do like how they're doing soprano sax on this one.
Yeah.
It really, really works well.
Yeah. So I think let's move along. Another fade out. Yes, we get it, Max. Max notes in all caps, yet another silly fade out. But
we'll have to keep moving it. I don't know. It'll just be a constant annoyance of mine, but whatever.
So, all right. The 9th track on the album is called Sensei Nina. And this one is like after that, it's like much more serene and much less dissonance. There's almost no dissonance on this, it feels like. And here it almost feels like the sun is setting on this journey and on this musical voyage. It feels like at this point, like things are starting, like all of the dissonance and everything, and feels like harmonious, and that we're starting to see the end of the day that is this musical journey. So I think it's starting to hint that like we're settling down and we're coming to peace.
I like that, and the word Sensei Nina, I believe, it's a Zulu reference to a protest or funeral song. So what you just described would fit really well. I mean, I think they hit the nail on the head with what they were wanting to come across. Some other notes I have was just on the particular sax solo. There's a lot of kind of big leaps, sheets of sound approach. There's some kind of Michael Brecker isms, I would say, honky low end. And it just seems like it's a lot of low ends of every single voice. At one time the piano plays really low in their left hand.
Feels like it's bringing you down, and it's doing that musically through going low. It's like starting to bring you down from that high that's been the rest of the album.
I think you're right. That's the way to put it. Is everything is just coming down to a close. It's at peace. The vocals are lower on this one. There's sort of a vocal fry in the male vocal, so we're just really getting down and low and coming at peace on this track.
I think that's interesting to where you say, like, it's all this theme. Like we felt it in different ways, and I said the sun setting, and I had not looked up the meaning of the word, but like, and you say like things are coming down, like musically they're coming down into a lower, they're coming from up to down, they're setting, but also the funeral meaning, which you're setting someone down and you're putting them to rest, but you're lowering them down. And so I think it's so interesting that there's an obvious like evocation of what you're trying to feel here. He's trying to make you feel that, and we felt it. And I explained it as maybe a sun setting, but a sun setting on a life and a funeral, and the way that they are able to do that. And you described it musically, like everything's getting low, it's coming down as if the sun's coming down, or as if you're lowering someone down. So beautiful. Yeah. I mean, it's obviously it did what it was intended to do in the way it made us feel. So I think this is you can tell that the sun is starting to set on this album, and leading into the final track on the album, the 10th track, which is Into, which feels like it's a continuation of Sensei Nina. It feels like the vibe is very similar. And this one, it feels like instead of coming down to that point, it feels like we've arrived, and now there's peace and clarity, which has taken a journey through the dissonant. This is why I wrote, it feels like the sun is finally set, and there's a sense of peace and clarity, which has taken a journey through the dissonant African free jazz landscape to arise at. You get major and minor colors here, a slight reprise to the piano chaos at the end, and then a very peaceful outro. So, yeah, it feels like this is like it feels like everything is, a sense of peace, a sense of clarity, and through the experience that we've been through on the album. And I think it's beautiful. It's a great way to end the album. What did you think about this final track, Max?
It is definitely a way to end the album. It's a continuation of the last song. It's pretty much Sensei Nina 2.0. And it is a nice bow or a button that I have been waiting for. But, and a lot of it, kind of halfway through, it's just solo piano. I get some, the way he's moving on the keys. It reminded me a little bit of Chopin and some of the kind of shorter songs that Chopin wrote. and just the harmonies. It really gave me a sense of Chopin for some reason.
And that definitely makes sense. After this is kind of what I was saying is it feels peaceful and like with clarity, like that feeling of Chopin, like his beautiful harmonies and melodies. That's something that we have not had that very much in the album. It's been very dissonant, very free, and and now we're finally feels like we're resolving to something.
That is one way to interpret it, and that's the way it's intended, I think. I personally don't get much from it. I think there's a better way to end it. I don't understand why. I mean, I can't understand why end it with a solo piano majority piece, but to me, it's more like a semicolon than a period. It left me wanting more. I think the listeners may agree this is the least listened to track on the album. That of course could be because it is shorter and
it's the last track on the album too. So if you're listening in order, this would be the one that you don't. You know what I'm saying? But I definitely I get what you're saying there. I think that also I wonder how intentional that is. It left you wanting more. Maybe that's what like. It feels like maybe this journey's done, but you want to embark on a new journey, like maybe that's what he's going for.
That's where it left me. I wanted more. I wanted something. If we were going to finish, have something with the whole band, or I just felt like more could be done. And maybe that's the point, is that you don't have to do more. You can take it where you want it to go, but I just had a big question mark at the end of this last track, and I that might be on purpose. That might be an issue with me. He might be able to express really in particular what he was going for, but I wanted more.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think it's interesting to see our different perspectives because after that, I think we had very different emotions. I listened to this again last night to a full time through, and I think when I got to this point, like I felt like I had been on this journey, and I felt like I was home, and I was at peace, and I was ready. I was kind of reflective, like where we've been, and so it's crazy. I guess it spoke to us in different ways, which is okay, and that's jazz, and like not we're gonna interpret things differently and experience things differently. I respect his choice to do it this way. I can see where you might want a different kind of resolution, and I definitely think it could have gone another way, and it would have been, he could have made a different choice, and that would have been fine too. So yeah, I just think it's interesting to see how we can interpret things differently on this one.
Why have two separate tracks? It's clear to me that this is a continuation of track number 9, Sensei Nina. Why are they two different songs? I mean, I guess if you're talking about a journey, into is kind of the home of everything else. That's where everything is. That's the final destination. When to me, the way they ended it, it's not a destination. It's more like a hostel instead of a home.
Oh man, I see what you're saying there. I don't know. I'm gonna have to agree to disagree on this one. But I definitely see what you're saying with that one. So let's go ahead and get into our top 3 tracks and our not so hot track. I think we might differ a little bit on this one actually. So I didn't put your top 3 in here, but I think you remember. All right. My top 3 is going to be, I think I made it extremely obvious that my top 3 was first, Mlewaini, and it's not even close in my opinion. The track is just the masterpiece of the album. I've said enough about it. I think it's the one track you can play to someone and it makes complete sense. The second track, I really liked its placement. I liked mostly the emotion and the feeling of the track was Mama. It's just so beautiful, so enchanting. And then third, and this one maybe should be second, but this is Omnyama, which is the track that we spoke about that really tied everything together. This track means a lot to the album, and it definitely had to make my top 3. And so for my not so hot album or track on the album, I think it's kind of obvious which one I'm gonna go with. It's Nyaninini Lee. This is when I said I had no clue what the hell was going on. I guess it's important to the album, but nonetheless, if you just play the song to me, it's not something that I'm gonna enjoy. It's not one that I could take out of the album and be like, oh, I like listening to this. So for that reason, it's gonna make my not so hot pick for this album.
Sure. Well, yeah, we differ a little bit. Your number 3 is my number 1. So my top 3, number 1 being Omnyama, which was the one where they kind of go back and forth between the 4 and the 2 feel. I just think that's so impressive, and it just flows so well. I really like the groove on that and the way they did that. So that's my number 1. My number 2 is your number 1, Mlewaini. That is one of the top hits of this album, and I think it was first released as a single.
Mm-hmm.
So
it makes sense as a single as well.
That's right. That one stands alone as great.
Can't put Nyaninini Lee as a single. That would make no damn sense. Like, here's a single. People would be like, what the hell is this album?
That would not go well. My number 3 is Re-Amathongo, which was the one that had a great groove. I love the ominous feeling overall that it gives. It just ended on the sax solo, and that just irked me. So everything else about it, it may have been number 1, but because of that, it's number 3. The Not So Hot is the last track of the album, Into.
I think we saw that coming.
As I mentioned, I was wanting more. It wasn't a home. It wasn't a destination. I don't want to go there.
Like I said, this is not my home. Oh man.
And the reason why your Not So Hot was not mine was because I was thoroughly entranced by how well they were just able to do certain things so well together. So
I can definitely understand that.
Yeah, my overall rating is 7 out of 10.
Cool.
Did you have an overall rating?
Yeah, I think you said 7.5 out of 10.
Oh, you're right.
Yeah.
7.5 out of 10.
Cool.
Yes.
Yeah. So I want to give my kind of overall thoughts, and then I'll talk about my my rating. So I think this album is definitely a journey. It's meant to be that way. It's not meant to be listened to on shuffle. It's meant to be listened to from the top to the bottom. And I think it's the kind of album you need to sit down and you have to listen to intently without interruption. It's not, I mean, you could put it on there in the background, but I think it's the journey that he wants you to experience. And I think it's worth doing that. It's worth sitting down, listening to. Maybe like when you're about to go to sleep, instead of watching Netflix, just put on this album and experience it. And I think it doesn't disappoint in that way. I really, Mlewaini stuck out to me a lot. It's a great track. Some of the dissonance and lack of tonality doesn't speak to me necessarily, but I do really understand and enjoy how Makhathini melds this together with different elements of jazz and African music. And it does feel like it's a spiritual journey, African journey through his lens. And I appreciate those elements, although it's not my favorite, like not what I'm going to choose to listen to daily. I get it, and I appreciate those things in this album and what it does for the album. So my overall score, I'm going to give it an 8.1 out of 10. Did you want to talk about your overall thoughts and then your rating again?
Yeah, I think generally speaking, it is a good album. Nduduzo Makhathini is a great musician, very spiritual, very intentional, has a great approach. He's still kind of young. He's in his 30s, 39, I think. And so there's a lot more to come from this guy and from South African jazz that I'm looking forward to. I think the album overall is a spiritual homage to kind of his homeland. He combines elements of McCoy Tyner, Thelonious Monk, John Coltrane. There is a distinct reference to some of the jazz greats in the history of this music. And I think overall it exemplifies the way one can think about soloing. It's not always what you play, but it's how you play and the way you express yourself musically, the way something is, played intentionally. Not necessarily, oh, you played a certain lick in a certain spot that fit really well, or, you played an idea really, really soulfully or something. And so how they did things on this album is something to really be impressed by. I would say overall, like I mentioned earlier, the overall rating is 7.5 out of 10.
Yeah, and I think so that very solid album. I think our overall combined score is going to be a 7.8 out of 10. It definitely is one that I would recommend listening to. It's got a bunch of elements that are really interesting, and it's a good listen, and it's a good journey to go on. So I definitely recommend that people go and check it out and do listen to it front to back. So cool. So those are our two albums for this week. We had Soul Station coming in at, what did we say, a 9.3, and then we had In the Spirit of N2 coming in at a 7.8 out of 10. And so our next episode, we're going to preview our albums. I picked out the classic album for our next episode, and I'm going with the great, one of the masterpieces of jazz. We have to do it. It had to come up on the show. We might as well do it now. We're going to do Go by Dexter Gordon. You're not going to want to miss that. It is just, oh man, there's going to be a lot to talk about. So yeah, our classic album is Go by Dexter Gordon. And Max, what were we getting into for our modern side of things?
Well, I had the distinct pleasure of picking the modern album, which was a little bit of a challenge for me there. And there is a very, very recent album. I think it's a live album of T.S. Monk called Two Continents, One Groove. And so I believe T.S. Monk is related to Thelonious Monk. I think he's a son. But if not, he's in some way related. So that'll be the modern album they're doing, and I'm looking forward to go with you, because Dexter, he's one of the cats. He's one of my guys, and that is a tremendous album.
He is the son of Thelonious Monk. He's a drummer, but the son of Thelonious. Just had to look it up. But yeah, I feel like I kind of spoiled you by picking Go, because you probably would. I was going to pick like Jimmy Smith or something, but I kind of spoiled you by picking Go. But I enjoy that album just as much as anyone else, so I'm super excited to really dive into it. I've listened to it a million times, but I've never done it in the way we're going to do it. So, and yeah, T.S. Monk, I don't think I've listened to anything by him, so I'm excited to check that out as well. So, yeah, I just want to say thank you guys for listening. If you're still with us, yeah, I had a really fun time listening to these two albums. Hopefully this can give you some perspective on different albums and a deep dive into some jazz, which is, kind of lacking at times. So I'm super excited to keep this series going. I want to thank Max for joining me. And I'm super excited to keep reviewing albums and listening to new stuff. And hopefully you guys can go through this journey with us.
Yeah, this is only the beginning. Is there an email or something people can send questions, suggestions, or ideas to?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you can email us at justjazzpod@gmail.com. Any questions, any suggestions? Please like us on Spotify, rate, review us, and email us if you have any questions. We might set up an Instagram channel for the podcast. We'll talk about that. But yeah, definitely if you have any questions, justjazzpod@gmail.com would be a great way to get in touch with us. And yeah, we'd love recommendations. If you have a new album or a classic album that you want us to talk about, please email that in, and we'll definitely consider checking it out. Cool. Well, For Max, I'm Dwayne. Thank you guys so much for joining us. This has been Just Jazz, and we'll catch you next time.